Hey folks, Steve here with another Fatal Alliances The Great War video. This time I'll be covering the air units of the game. My last video covered the land unit, so if you're wanting to learn about the different kinds of land units in Fatal Alliances The Great War, you should go check out that video. Uh, Covering the air units this time, first thing I should note right out of the gate is that there aren't quite as many force pools for the aircraft unit, so there are fewer overall types. But what makes it kind of interesting is that even within a single force pool type, the aircraft counters will differ from each other even within the same force pool by quite a good bit, as opposed to some of the land units where maybe you just see one or two numbers slightly different. Here, there's actually quite a bit of difference. And even looking at the example counters I have here, I've pulled out some example counters of each type to talk to as we go. That there's a lot of information contained on the counters. It can seem a little intimidating in comparison to the land units, which look like pretty standard war game counters. The aircraft counters typically have these 5 numbers on them in the different quadrants or the corners of the counters, and usually the one in the middle. If you have the game, then you have the unit description sheet that will lay this out for you, what all these numbers mean, but the quick version is the yellow number is the form of range and how many hexes they can travel for various missions and purposes and rebasing purposes. Obviously, higher numbers better. You're going to have greater range. The top left number is the air-to-air combat factors, so the number of combat factors used when aircraft units are fighting aircraft units. The top right value is air-to-sea factors, and that comes in when conducting air-to-sea combat, which can happen in the game as planes can try to disrupt sea vessels in the sea zones. The bottom left is the tactical factors, so this is related to things like tactical bombing and how that impacts certain combats. And the bottom right is the strategic bombardment factors, which is used to do strategic bombing, go figure, and we'll talk to that. So, right away you'll see that certain types of units here are going to be better at some things than others, as opposed to World War II, where maybe you have really specialized roles for planes. World War I was sort of the beginning of utilizing air power in wars, so you get to see sort of the progression of how these aircraft were used from the early war, where you really aren't relying on them much, to sort of the later war, where it's a little more important, and you can get some interesting situations coming up out of that. The first thing to note right away is that the aircraft have missions that they go on. They don't quite work like the land units where you move them and then you conduct a land combat phase. Really what it is that these planes can go on particular missions. Some of these missions include going on a naval air mission, which all that really means is that a plane with air-to-sea factors like this Zeppelin here can be moved to a sea zone, which then means that they can be used for naval air combat, potentially helping with search roles when your Navy's trying to find the enemy's Navy to fight, and they can potentially also conduct strategic warfare against convoys that may be in a sea zone that you're attempting to patrol. So it's sort of a minor thing, not quite as interesting as, say, World War II planes on an aircraft carrier or something along those lines, but it is doable in this game. The strategic bombardment mission, utilizing those strategic bombardment factors, will be used to, after, assuming they can get to their target, and I'll talk a little bit about how that really works. Assuming they can get to their target, they'll roll some dice, consult a chart, and say if an enemy plane was strategic bombarding Glasgow, there's a potential that the 2 production points that would be generated here because of the 2 factories, assuming they got the resources that they needed, It could be that these production points are nullified and that the Commonwealth, the UK, won't get the production points for that. So that can be pretty important to the long scheme of the game to use strategic bombardment to hurt the enemy's production. And that'll be much easier before fighter planes come into play, and we'll get to that. Planes utilizing their tactical factors can do ground strikes just like artillery. Basically meaning you'll roll a die, and if it's that number or less on the die, you can flip enemy units. That is affected by weather and terrain. And really all of these missions are sort of impacted by weather and terrain. But you also have ground support, which in this game kind of comes in two flavors, though they're treated pretty similarly within the context of the rules. One is the standard World in Flames, I think, method of ground support, which is you take the tactical factors, say like this unit here, the tactical factor of 3, and you'll add it to the combat factors. You'll add those combat factors to a land combat that is occurring. So as part of the land combat sequence, you may be selecting air units to be involved to provide ground support, and they'll add their combat factors to the overall combat factors you have. However, they can only provide a matching amount. So you'll get 3 combat factors with this unit, assuming you already have 3 land unit combat factors involved in the battle. If you only had 2, for some reason, the most you could get from this plane would be 2. The other way that ground support is leveraged in this game, and is sort of unique to Fatal Alliance as being a World War I game, is you would use ground support for reconnaissance, and it's actually a really important part of this game, especially in the early war, that you have air units providing reconnaissance, and sort of the method by which reconnaissance is done is treated the same as ground support. You have to have an available unit that can do it, and they can provide either the avoiding a negative to the die roll for combat, or adding adding a penalty if you're a defender with observation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then all aircraft can do a rebase, which basically just means they are going to move up to double their range to another hex after they're done performing some mission. And if they're doing that over friendly areas, I believe that is even triple their movement range as sort of a strategic redeploy of the planes. I've arranged the counters here as we talk through them in roughly sort of chronological order, and what is neat about this game is that you do get the technological advancement, probably even more so than the land units, because at the very beginning of the game you start with balloons and zeppelins and some scout planes before progressing to more advanced basic bomber planes, even more advanced larger bomber planes, to fighters, and even some basic naval bombers. So it's pretty interesting how your strategy will change as these units become available. Quick note, there is a difference between balloons and zeppelins, and just to show that difference, this is a balloon used for scouting. You can see the little carriage here. Someone would sit in that as the balloons would be over the battlefield doing reconnaissance. But this is a zeppelin, much, much larger, and you can see the compartment here, a lot more room compared to the carriage in the other picture, and they're definitely much more useful, I would say, types of units. You know, you can go Google this if you're unfamiliar with the concept. So there are differences, even though maybe in the counters they look kind of similar. Obviously the balloons are kind of shorter and fatter in the artwork. We'll talk about balloons first, since those are available right at the beginning of the game for most every faction. And there's not a whole lot to say about these guys. they really don't have much in the way of any combat factors. You do have this one sort of naval airship, which has one air to sea factor for like sea patrols that some balloons did do, and some tactical. So this is maybe the most advanced balloon you're going to get, and this is called an airship here, and I'm a little unsure if this is classified as a capital NAV nav unit or not, but I consider it a balloon. But for the most part, the balloons you see are going to have this star, meaning they don't have any factors of this type, and a 0 for air to air, and all they're useful for is observation. So they provide the ground support mission during a land combat, and assuming that there's no fighters there shooting them down, which there won't be at the beginning of the game, they'll just prevent you from suffering a penalty during land combat, just providing the reconnaissance that you're supposed to have before you have a real successful attack. And besides that, they're not useful. Typically, they have the short range of 1 hex, so they're going to go into the hex that you're attacking at most, so they need to kind of be in the front lines. And I think over time, they sort of just become replaced by better air units, but they're kind of a fun little addition. 99 lift balloons go by. Certainly neat to have them in the game. But by and large, the zeppelins are much better. The zeppelins are also early aircraft. They can be used for observation, so if you need them for that purpose because of your offensive you're conducting, they can be used for that. They do have tactical factors, which means that they can do things like ground strikes. They also have an okay strategic bombardment factor. These examples having 2, which maybe isn't a huge number of factors, but there aren't that many other units that can provide any of those. And you can see even some of these guys do have some air-to-sea factors for naval patrolling. Their range tends to be pretty high. You can see just in comparison to the balloons that the range can be 8, 9. This one says 50, and it's a special unit that I'll talk to more in a second. But overall, they can reach quite a ways. 9 hexes is a lot, and in fact, in the beginning of the game, I believe it's either this or this Zeppelin. If I look at the date, 1912. So this Zeppelin starts the game available on the map for the Germans, and if you were to place that Zeppelin and say, you just pick a place, right? Williamshaven. If it's 9 hexes for its range, you can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it can hit London, right? And that's sort of the whole idea of Zeppelins above London and bombing campaigns. They can reach out and touch someone, which can be kind of important if you want to disrupt some things behind the lines or hit the enemy in places where they think that they're safe, at least at the beginning of the game. This particular unit here, the white print Zeppelin here with the white number, I read this as the range is 50, which is absurd, but there you go, range of 50, and it can provide 1 reorganization point as a mission to unflip a unit. I guess that represents providing some sort of supplies, and it can potentially also transport 1 infantry or mountain division, though a mountain division reduces its range. So it's kind of an oddball unit here. I'm sure I could probably, with enough research, figure out why it's being represented that way. But it's interesting that you have such a long reach with it. It's just kind of interesting. Might be maybe well, I don't even know. I won't begin to guess at what this is really representing. But yeah, so these guys, they're going to be useful in the early game. They do have okay air-to-air combat factors, so that once Air-to-air combat starts happening in the game. They're actually not going to be completely terrible like the balloons are, um, and that should be uh, uh, again useful in the early game. This particular Zeppelin here with the orange arrow denotes that this thing has extended range, allowing it to use quadruple its printed range for rebases or times their range by 6 over friendly territory. So this can move even farther in a single move if rebasing. So there are a few other units that have that orange, like some bombers down here, which we'll talk to. So they're pretty good. The one thing to watch out for is that once the game changes with fighters entering the game in 1915, these become more susceptible. Because at the beginning of the game, there are no air-to-air combat capabilities. You need fighters for that. So without fighters on the board, these things are pretty dangerous just in what they can do, and that they can reach out and hit someone and conduct some strategic warfare and strategic bombardment. So pretty valuable in the early game. The next set of units are kind of interesting. The game categorizes them as LND aircraft, sort of like land bombers. Of course, the reality is some of these are not really, I don't know if I would call them bombers in a strict sense, but I suppose they are. And in the early game, some countries actually start with a few of these, and they usually look like this, very similar to a balloon. They can't do much in the term of bombing. They can't do much for sea, but a plane like this, and I'm going to talk strictly to the 2 build cost land LND bombers, because there is a difference. Just as an example, these are both technically of the same type. They're both considered LND aircraft units, but these are this one's cost 2, and this whole one in this row here, all the ones in this row are cost 2. These are going to be cost 3 and 4, and so they're technically part of a different force pool. And I would even say, in terms of game mechanics, they're almost totally different units. Again, these are early aircraft, the biplane type of, the stereotypical old-timey plane. Their range is usually limited 2 to 4, so they're a little bit better than balloons in some regard, but again, the early ones aren't going to have much in the way of actual bombing factors, and they're going to be used for observation, just like the balloons. At least the very early ones that you have at the beginning of the game. As the game goes on, and you add later year units to the force pools, you will get some variation in that some of these guys will have either some strategic factors, some tactical factors, increasing air-to-air factors for once air combat actually really starts to come into play. But they are sort of limited in ability. This one here, this Junker plane, is probably one of the better ones, and this one comes in pretty late in the game, 1918, but you can see it's got a pretty strong air-to-air factor. It's got pretty good tactical bombing abilities, actually quite good, so you would consider this a tactical bomber probably in World War II era games, but it can't do much else than that, and so they're good, they can do some bombing, but they aren't fighters, so even though you might think of them maybe as fighters, or consider them like that, the top-down view, and that's sort of something to notice here, that the angle by which the art is looking, how you're viewing the plane is going to help denote what kind of plane it is. The top-down are all LND units. So all of these guys, they're not really fighters. They can't do things that fighters can do, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So at best, what they're going to be doing is performing some minor bombing missions and observation. And because they have pretty good air-to-air factors in the later parts of the war, they can be all right lead bombers. And And without getting too deep into the combat mechanics of that and how air-to-air combat works, you line up your fighters, you line up your bombers, and you designate a lead fighter and a lead bomber. And when combat's actually conducted, you really only care about your fighters. You take your lead fighters factors, you add up additional fighters that you have, the number of them, and that is going to provide your air combat roll on the chart. But if all of your fighters are gone, then you're only going to use the air-to-air combat factor of your lead bomber. And so while maybe you'll have some of these really good strategic bombers down here for your strategic bombing mission, you might have this plane go with them potentially and help keep them safe by having it as the lead bomber, because the lead bomber and the lead fighter units are the ones that are going to be impacted by combat losses first in air-to-air combat. I probably don't have time to go over all of the mechanics of air-to-air combat. I'll probably do some example demonstration videos later in different examples of what that can look like and why you might choose different units over others. Getting into the 3 and 4 cost LND aircraft bombers, they typically come later in the game. These two units, you can see 1917, though oddly the Russians actually start with this unit here at the beginning of the game, and it's actually one of the better higher cost LND aircrafts in the whole game, strangely enough, and you can look up this plane on the internet and read about it. All of these guys typically have pretty good range. They're maybe somewhere in the middle between your basic cheap bombers and zeppelins in terms of range. They can hit pretty far distance. Maybe you may not be hitting London with them, but they're still useful. They do have decent air-to-air combat factors. They do have some patrol ability for some of the counters, not all of them. You can see this German one doesn't have a C factor. They're not too great at tactical bombing, but their strength really is in that strategic bombing. So if you can get these guys in the right location to hit the enemy factories, that's going to cause a lot of issues over the life of the game. But of course, by the time these guys are really in the game, you likely have fighters, so you will have to make sure that you protect these guys with their own fighter escorts, which we'll talk about fighters in just a second. And again, like I mentioned before, this fighter has extended range. Keep an eye out for that orange arrow denoting that. And just a quick call out as you look at these example counters, you can see again, individual counters, even if they're of the same type, may have completely different capabilities. This plane, same type, a 2-cost land bomber, can't do strategic bombardment, but this one can. And it's the exact same type. It's a different country's force pool, but it is just different plane designs reflected in the counters. It's just kind of interesting. So don't buy a unit expecting you're definitely going to get a certain type of combat factor, because you might not get it when you draw from your force pool. Next up are the fighters, and that's denoted by planes flying sideways at a flat inclination. You can see down here, these are different units. There's sort of diving. These guys are just straight flying. They are FTRs, fighters. They start to come in the game during 1915, and they are the only unit that can take the quote-unquote fighter role, thus allowing air-to-air combat to begin. Every other air unit in the game is going to take on what's considered the bomber role in a naval, or I'm sorry, an air mission. And what that really just means is that before fighters enter the scene, it's just assumed that the bombers are conducting their actions without interference. There aren't bombers fighting bombers. They're both doing what they intend to do without interference. But the fighters, once they enter the game, now cause the air-to-air combat system to kick in. and the need to have fighters escorting bombers and fighters attacking bombers, and now those zeppelins aren't so cool because now you need to put a lot more resources in to defend them. One thing to note is that fighters can potentially take the bomber role. So if you wanted to, and they had the combat factors for it, you could designate a fighter as a bomber, but they can't do scouting. They can't do recon like a balloon and these low-cost bombers can do, or really any other unit can do. So if you're going to put them in the bomber role, they're just there to maybe defend other bombers or to do tactical bombing. I don't think there are any fighter units with actual strategic bombing. That would seem silly. But they can take the bomber role. And it's kind of weird and confusing. Read the aircraft rules. I think it's section 16 of the rule book. Read through that to get what I'm trying to explain here, that it's not just the type, but there are roles in combat that you designate. Most of these fighters are only going to have air-to-air factors, right? You see stars here. They're not doing anything else but doing air-to-air combat. And typically they're going to have higher air-to-air combat factors than any other unit up to this point. You can see this is a weaker example. This French plane isn't particularly strong, but you do get things like the Fokker, which is much stronger, and included in the force pools are the ace pilot units, like the Red Baron here, who's got a 9 combat factor, and I think that might be the strongest in the game. But even some of these other aces, I mean, it's stronger than the normal unit of that same type by a pretty good margin. So you will be excited to get to use these guys, and it is a nice touch in the game that you get the ace pilot units, and how much better they are. These fighters are the only units capable of combat air patrol, escort, and intercept. And basically what that really means is during your impulse, as you're designating things to be hit by bombers, the opposite side, your opponent player, can give fighters combat air patrol missions to protect certain hexes. And they can also intercept. And why you might do combat air patrol versus intercept, and you might think, well, what's the difference between the two? It is related to range. So you may put, combat air patrol in a place that they may not be able to intercept from. And it's just all about location and placement that is going to determine why you might pick one over the other. The other big thing being escorting, which basically just means you're taking a fighter with you with your bombers, and when air combat is taking place, the fighters are going to be involved in that combat with your bombers to protect them. So, like I said, when 1915 comes and the fighters enter the fray, it causes a change in the way aircraft are used and the impacts of aircraft on every other bit of the game, because you're adding that extra layer of strategy and resource allocation. The final naval, the final aircraft type is the NAV, capital NAV aircraft, NAV, or I believe this is meant to be naval bombers. They're later game additions. You can see 1918, 1917. And seemingly, in my search through the counter pools, only the Commonwealth and the United States will get them. They are okay with air-to-air factors, though not, they're not terribly strong compared to some other units. They have minimal tactical factors, though they are there. Some of them, one of them anyway, seems to have some strategic bombing capability, though not particularly strong, and you would almost expect this. They do have air-to-sea factors. This one has 1, this one has 2. Maybe not particularly great, but in terms of all the aircraft with naval-to-sea factors, they do seem to have the most, or at least the Kaku does. So they're certainly useful in that role, of being put out on naval air missions and patrolling sea zones. Um, it is one thing to point out is that they do provide a +1 bonus to search rolls if one of them's committed in a sea combat situation where you're searching for the enemy. So they are sort of scouting the seas, helping look for the enemy to engage. So they do provide that bonus. This unit here has a blue stripe on it, and it's even called out on the unit description sheet that it is a flying boat with a blue vertical bar, this particular unit. And I think it's the only one in the game with this blue stripe bar. Looking in the rulebook, I couldn't find I couldn't find what that denoted. I assumed it had some strange rule regarding what it allowed you to do, and I ended up looking in the World in Flames rule set to see if this is something there, and there is. So in World in Flames, there's a particular optional rule that basically means that a naval bomber with a blue strip may only stack in a coastal hex. A coastal hex being these lighter blue hexes that are part of, that contain land and are connected to sea zones. So this unit could only stack here or here, but not down here in the middle of Northern Ireland. But again, that's not called out in the actual rulebook at all, and I suspect it may have been either an oversight in the rules being written, or an oversight, I guess, in the counter design. So if you're playing this game with a buddy, you may want to talk about whether or not you want to impose that restriction on this unit. There's only one of it, so maybe it's not a big deal. And then otherwise, this Commonwealth unit doesn't have the bar, and so really, it's not that different than some of these land bombers. The only difference being it's got a pretty decent score for the naval to sea factors. Yeah, so that's it. Like I said, not very many different varieties. You figure maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of units. But again, each unit needs to kind of be looked at individually to determine how best to use it. I could see some situations where some of these cheaper bombers you may be utilizing purely in a tactical bomber type sense once you get the better units in the game, where these are just straight up strategic bombers. And your fighters are doing the fighter thing, and then maybe you've got the zeppelins backing everybody else up. But that's as far as it gets with the air units, and I think for the most part, in terms of trying to represent air combat of World War I, it does a pretty good job. You've got the observation and recon aspect that was important, the leveraging of zeppelins to do a lot of different things, and then finally the sort of reaction to the zeppelins and planes in general with advanced planes like the fighters coming in and trying to disrupt and intercept bombing missions. There's not. It will seem maybe at times that the air units aren't super effective. This isn't like the grand strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, but they are there to help, and they can make a pretty big difference, especially when you're doing strategic bombing, and you're hurting the enemy's ability to produce. That's going to be helpful no matter what in this game. Yeah, and that's it. I think I'll do another video here coming up soon regarding the sea vessels, all the naval units and their capabilities. There's a fair number of those, and some big discussion, I think, that I could have here describing how to leverage those units. So we'll see how that goes, and for those as well, I'm sure that once I cover the units, I'll need to create some example videos on how you conduct a naval combat and why you would, choose to use certain ships over others for a given situation. And does it make sense to send a gigantic stack out to sea? What are the pros and cons of all of that? We can cover that, and I can cover some good examples of some air missions. So I'll work on that as time allows. If you want to see a particular kind of example or video regarding this game, let me know in the comments or send me a message, and I'll see what I can do. I may be able to cover other games in the future. This one's just sort of taking my attention and holding on to it strongly, so I want to keep talking about this game. Though I do have a lot of other games in my collection that I do like and I could talk about. Um, Hex Encounter, monster games I'm still pretty new to, so this is good for me to review the rules and to learn them and teach them. I'm having fun, so hopefully this is useful for some folks. Besides that, we'll catch you later, and see you in the next video.